All right. Are we good? Yeah. All right, cool. Thanks. Yeah, thanks everyone for still sticking around, and thanks for actually the leads of the sustainability project to accepting the talk, right? So I will talk a little bit about something that has to do with sustainability. However, it's a different angle on what you probably heard today a little bit. Yeah, my name is Christian. I'm running a company called 9 Elements. I'm managing the whole firmware department there, and I'd like to talk with you about the role of open firmware in the hardware lifecycle extension, right? And one of the tenets, as you know, is sustainability of OCP, right? And out of that OCP, out of that sustainability, one of the things that came out of that was circular economy. Right, so the idea of giving the hardware that got decommissioned in data centers, giving it a second life, right? So, and if you look at the principles of circular economy, I listed them there. They name a couple of these, right? Life, obviously, yeah, life extension. How can we reuse these? All right. How can we reuse these? How can we repair these kind of things? So, and a lot of these things actually have to do with firmware, right? So we cannot just make that up. It kind of depends on firmware. And if you look at the current lifetime, of firmware on these server systems, right now, a normal firmware, it gets supported, 4 to 8 years, something like that, right? Depending on what the vendor, the OEM and ODM, right, kind of make up with the firmware vendor, but it has like a very limited lifespan, let's say. If we're thinking about circular economy, we need to think longer than these 4 to 8 years, right? We are thinking 10 years, 12 years, or even more, right? So I talked to a company a couple of weeks ago, and they said, we are planning to run the servers that we have for 12 years plus, right, if we can, right? So the workload that we have on these servers, they don't need to be top-notch all the time. They want to have it running for a very, very long time. So what we have is essentially a gap that is there between when the support of firmware ends, right, when it drops to end of life, versus the circular economy and lifetime extension of these server systems. So, and that is an issue that we have to think about and that we have to solve. So, what actually happens if firmware becomes end of life, right? It doesn't get any updates anymore. That's like the very basic answer to that, right? And that means no security fixes anymore, no support whatsoever, right? You have a system that might work or that normally works, but it doesn't get any updates anymore. And we all kind of know that updates are probably important in a life cycle, in the software life cycle. So, meaning if you have a hardware which has firmware on it, which is end of life, that means it's not usable for any use case, essentially, anymore. And the issue is, what happens if a security bug comes in, right? What happens if something happens with the firmware? Who's actually responsible for it, and who takes care of that, right? Is it the OEM, ODM, right? Is it the original owner that sold you the system? Right? Is it the IBV that wrote the firmware in the first place? Who takes care of that? And it might be the original owner, or it might be the IBV. And also there's the question, who can actually fix it, right? On the one hand side, who's responsible for it, but who can also fix it? And that is like a very limited circle of people and companies who can actually fix it. So I brought a showcase with me, right? So we were working with the system, it's called the OCP Tioga pass. It's from 2017, so fairly old, 7-8 years, right? And it's a Skylake, into Skylake systems. The original bias in BMC came from IMI, and that doesn't matter. It could be any other company, any other IBV. However, it's not supported anymore, right? So that means host firmware is not supported anymore. BMC firmware is not supported anymore. And you have like besides these two big stacks, you have like a dozen of other firmware on these server systems that probably is also not supported anymore. So I took the latest and greatest firmware that was on these servers, and I put those into the binary risk hunt tool, right? Binary is a company that are experts in firmware security, so they can find known and unknown CVEs in these firmware. And the result was kind of crucial, right? So we have like a lot of top-notch CVEs, right? High security issues in that firmware right now. And that goes into circular economy, and that gets a second life somewhere else, right? At a bank, at a, at a smaller CSP, I don't know, right? So, and that's kind of an issue, and you probably don't want to have that thing which is like a bomb in your infrastructure. And that's like what it's all about, right? And besides security is one point, obviously, right? And security is an issue, right? But besides that, you don't get any new features on that. You don't get any maintenance or support or whatsoever, right? You're just stuck with a server where there are there are blobs on the server that you cannot touch, you cannot change, you can do nothing with that. And that's a big problem for circular economy. So how do we solve that, right? Like, what's the solution to all of that? And probably like the talk title teasered it, right? But obviously, open source firmware is the solution to all of that, right? With open source firmware enables you, right, to take control over your own system, right? Instead, when you buy the hardware and you have open source firmware running on these things, you can also own the hardware, right? Because the issue right now is if you're buying hardware and you don't own the software that is running on that, and firmware is a pretty essential part of every system, because without firmware, without proper firmware, it's a pretty massive brick. And that's it, essentially. So open source firmware allows you to take back control on these kind of things. And we are at the Open Platform Firmware group within OCP are working on open host firmware and also on openBMC firmware. For host and BMC firmware, there's like a couple of mature projects and projects that you can use and that you can run on these servers. But there are many, many more firmwares on these, right? We're talking about NIC firmware, we're talking about firmware for drives, all these kind of things. And we essentially have to think about that when we're thinking about sustainability, and when we're thinking about circular economy, we have to think that all these kind of pieces are on that, and how does a solution long-term for this looks like, right? So if we're decommissioning that hardware out of our data centers, who takes this stuff, and how do they maintain it afterwards? Are they able to maintain it or not? So circular economy actually gives us a whole new opportunities of doing business, right, and having partnerships. So they're enabling circular economy means that there have to be a couple of companies and people and groups working together, like the ones that are reselling that, the small and medium enterprise businesses that are actually buying these decommissioned servers, IBVs that can still support these servers because they have open firmware running on it, and of course all the open source firmware projects. And besides that ecosystem that we are kind of have to build up or building up already, OCP also has a couple of programs that try to help us on moving server systems out of data centers and giving them a second life, right? There's like the lock program, for example, that's about how do we decommission drives and this kind of things. OCP has a SAFE program, which kind of looks into writing safe and secure firmware from the start, right? And maybe openness could be one of these points there. So all of that we have to put together and have to think about when we're thinking about circular economy and when we're thinking about sustainability. So what we did here at 9Elements is really take that OCP Tioga path, right, and make that publicly available, right, so you can fetch the code everywhere. It's integrated in the upstream open source projects, right? It's nothing that we own. You can take it from there. It's running in production at a customer that is having that. So feel free to check that out if you're interested in that. And the call to action is a little bit different from what you heard until today. It's not join the OCP sustainability call. It's join the OCP platform firmware call, right? And or join our sessions tomorrow. And really think about, you know, circular economy when you're actually producing these servers, right? When these servers landing in the data centers, think about how do we decommission these things and how do we actually give them a second life? Because that should be part of the equation when these things get produced on how can we maintain all of these stacks that are on there long term, right? And part of that is choosing the right firmware stack that is running on these things. That's one of the crucial points. So, as I said, embrace open source firmware if you can, think about it all, and join our workstream calls if you're interested in that. Thanks.